From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Ron Charles, the fiction editor of the Washington Post, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. I discovered Stephen Millhauser late in 1997. My mother gave me a copy of Martin Dressler, which had just won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. As many of you know, it's a fantastic and fantastical novel about a young entrepreneur in New York toward the end of the 19th century. Although I'm often at a loss to remember novels I reviewed even last month, I can still recall, 15 years later, whole scenes of Martin Dressler's maze-like hotel. That unforgettable, dreamlike quality is the most striking element of Mr. Millhauser's novels and short stories, which have long appeared in the New Yorker magazine. Again and again in his tales, we encounter things just beyond what we think of as possible, described in prose that makes them seem strikingly real. Last year, he won the Story Prize and was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award for his latest collection, We Others. Praising the book in the Washington Post, Michael Dirda wrote, "His works illustrate the very definition of the uncanny, that moment when the homey or familiar suddenly swerves into something rich, strange, and menacing." If you'd like to go get a book autographed by Mr. Millhauser, he'll be at the signing tent at 2 o'clock. Please join me in welcoming him. We Others is a collection of new and selected stories. I'm wondering, what was that process like? What were you looking for as you looked back over your career? Were you trying to select what the best, the most representative, the ones you thought people would like most?
It's a good question because I wrestled with that. I thought, all right, this was presented to me as a sort of retrospective. So shouldn't I think of myself as sort of the editor of some other writer, choosing representative stories? And that became incredibly boring to me. I wasn't interested in being a representative of myself, whatever that means. And I finally stopped being sort of meticulously, accountable. And I just read myself, as I sometimes do, as if I were not myself. I'm somebody else. I don't know who this writer is. And if a story drew me in any way at all, I chose it. And if it didn't, alas, I exiled it.
So these are the stories you liked best?
Stories I liked best.
Yeah.
I'm feeling guilty about, of course, all the stories that I eliminated, but that's who I am.
Let's talk about the buildings in your stories. These strange rooms and weird spaces that people get lost in. Why do such rooms and buildings recur in your fiction?
If I had a shrink, you should probably ask him. But the truth is, real buildings are very strange. And you know that when you're a child and your parents take you for the first time to an immense, to the Museum of Natural History, in my case in New York or here, and here's a room full of triceratops, and there's a room full of strange ducks, and there are some aborigines. It's astonishing. The first time you go to an airport, the first time you go to an immense department store with things changing. So, although of course I'm inventing buildings, I'm actually, I think, building on the reality of the strangeness of immense buildings and wanting to acknowledge that. Even a house is a very strange thing, with many rooms and attics and cellars haunted it's a childlike view of buildings, and I think that's where it comes from.
In your stories, we do see a lot of strange things, like a mannequin might walk out of a department store window, or someone might fall in love with a giant frog. Mm-hmm. You once said, disruption is at the center of many of my stories, the sudden emergence of strangeness from the ordinary. What do you mean by that, disruption?
A lot of what I do is a not necessarily conscious protest against the general movement thought of as realism. And I love the great realists, by which I mean the 19th century realists and their 20th century followers. But realism is really a 19th century movement. It has its own cliches, its own expectations, and it can pretend to look at the world the way it really is. That's the claim, the noble claim of realism.
Right.
I'm going to show you what is really there because you've never paid attention to it before. And mainline, middle-of-the-road realism, my temperament argues, isn't doing that anymore.
Is it
and
real?
I wish to disrupt that by breaking away from it. It's unusual for me to introduce giant frogs into my,
Yes,
my
it's
story.
not an
Usually
average story.
it's a slight swerve away from what is expected, and you enter territory that is less, it's not certain whether it's real or semi-dreamlike. But I would argue that this represents a way of passing through the world that many of us have.
That's more real than what we call realism.
I'm perversely making that argument, yes.
Frank Norris complained about realism. Remember the drama of the broken teacup? His problem was it was too dull. That's not your complaint, though.
No.
Not dullness
Well,
so much.
Dullness is one part of it, but I have a more aggressive complaint, which is that it claims to be real and is not. It's real in certain obvious ways. If somebody writes about their experience in a war and really knows something that I don't, I bow down to that, of course. It's the shape and movement of an entire story or book as representing the way things are in the world, a truthful representation. I, in general, dissent from that. And the way I dissent ends up with strange buildings and odd swerves and disruptions.
Now, in several of your stories, you've written about some dangerous laughter in the room in the attic. You read about teenagers. Several stories are about children. Is there something about that period of life that is attractive to you?
It's attractive and terrifying. Adult life, like my argument about realism, tends to have made up its mind, except at certain crises, about what's real and what isn't real in the world, how things work and how they don't. When you're a certain kind of child, possibly protected as I was, the world is full of astonishing wonders, which you gradually wean yourself from as you get older. But they're also still there. The things that you perceive as wonderful as a child are not delusions. Yes, you stop believing that dragons and witches exist, possibly, but the things that frighten you in the night still frighten you in the night. And adolescence in particular is, to me, utterly fascinating because it is not yet adulthood. You are, insofar as you're thinking of adults, you're often rebelling against a representative adult, and there's a real tug at the same time toward the childhood that you're happily out of but are tempted back to. So it's a very unstable time in which anything can happen, and that makes it peculiarly attractive to me.
You have any children?
I have 2 children, and and they made it from childhood into adolescence into young adulthood. I think without too much damage.
Now,
I read to them a lot.
Okay. Your work is filled with these revelations that seem to transcend ordinary life. What in another context might be called a sort of spiritual sense or religious sense of the world, but I don't get the feeling that religion plays a big part in your fiction. Is that fair?
I think that's a very accurate statement, right.
Why is that? Are you trying to reach what religions are trying to reach, that same transcendent sense of the ordinary world?
If it's true that a religion is trying to reach a transcendent sense, whatever that means, of the ordinary world, then yes. But if you take it one step further and begin talking about a personal savior who is attending to my moral being, then I dissent from that.
That doesn't play a part in your fiction that I know of.
No.
Now, the title of your most recent collection, We Others, reminded me that you use, and the collection itself, of course, that you use these plural first-person narrators several times, not frequently. That seems like a difficult voice to speak from if you're not the Queen of England or something. What is it that draws it to you, that draws that to you, or that draws you to that?
What makes you think I'm not the Queen of England? We is really we is difficult. It sounds like I should say we are difficult. We is difficult. Because it's impersonal. You can't attach to it a particular personality the way you can attach it, of course, to an I or a he or a she. But precisely for that reason, it isn't used much. And one reason I'm attracted to it is simply that it's an unfamiliar pronoun for narration. So it's unexplored. It is thrilling in that sense. But more precisely, if you define yourself as a we, and it's not that weird to do that. Most of us have occasions in our lives when we speak as we as the member of a certain group, we the parents of children in the 5th grade, and you are speaking in a communal voice. And inevitably, if you speak in a communal voice, you are including members who are like you in a group, and automatically, logically excluding others. So I would argue that we is a inherently dramatic pronoun. We are in a town, a knife thrower comes to town, he's an outsider, he is performing for us. A stranger comes to town. We respond to it as a normal group of people disturbed by someone who is outside. So we can be used against the other in a very fruitful way, I would argue.
Nice.
And in addition, it's almost unexplored, and therefore it's very exciting.
As fantastical as many of your stories are, they frequently involve a great deal of precise historical detail. Is there a tension between wanting to get those details exactly right and wanting to distort them in some way? How do you do that research?
Absolutely. Well, in certain historical works, I do lots of research. It's complicated, I think, because when I'm doing research, I'm writing about something I explicitly don't know much about. And whenever you're looking at the past, there is some element of the fantastic about the past. These are people rode around in horses and buggies. There were no cars. Their pajamas looked different. Their hats were fun. So there is already something strangely fantastic about it. You have to overcome that, familiarize yourself with the day-to-day detail, and that's already complicated. And then within that, at a certain point, whenever I research a story, I stop and I say to myself, I could in fact write a nonfiction study of this period.
Department stores of the 19th century.
Department stores, which I'd love to do, but I don't want to do that. I'm writing a story, and the reason I chose this age is that it is helpful, useful for some fictional agenda that I have. And then I start inventing. And I've actually deliberately undermined actual facts that I proudly found, and then I just changed them to remind myself, you're not an historian. If you can be an historian if you want, but you're not. So assert the fictional within history.
It's a fascinating effect, over and over again.
Thanks. And it's dizzying,
yes.
because the real and the fantastic mingle in a particular way that they don't when I'm writing about contemporary life.
Right. People often get lost in your stories or confront things that surprise them suddenly. Do you feel the same way when you're writing, or from the start, do you have a clear idea of what's going to happen, what you're going to find?
When I was in my 20s, if I had a single idea, I would sit down and start writing.
Yes.
And 15 or 30 minutes later, I would stop writing because that's all I had. Now, much more. I will have an idea, I'm not sure about it, and I will forbid myself to write for long periods of time, literally weeks.
Just thinking about it.
Turning over the idea. I can no longer write the opening sentence unless I know how the story is going to end, because the ending, as I think of it, casts a shadow backwards over the entire story and touches the first sentence. I have a plan in mind, which can be undermined as I begin to write, but I have the delusion, let's say, of clarity as I'm writing a story.
Do you have a sense it'll be a short story or a novel or a novella? The length
It's
determines.
harder with a novel, but I definitely have to know. Otherwise, I'm going to shut down at some point.
And the length has some influence on the kind
It's
of.
much easier to imagine a full length for a story that's going to be 15 pages long than one that's 125, not to say 500. Sure. But I work it out.
Newspaper readers are frequently surprised that reporters don't make up the headlines for their own stories.
When I first learned that, I was deeply disillusioned. Well, why don't you?
Not only, and then they're added later, and you're often not consulted. Usually, you're not consulted about the headline. Short story titles are different. They're important. They're
Not
part
only
of
are
the
they
story.
different, and not only important for me, but I actually think of the title as literally the first sentence of a story.
Oh.
The first thing a reader sees in a story is its title. And unlike many of my students who write stories and then hand in stories saying title undecided, which I think is a great title. The title, I cannot sit down and write a story unless I have that title. And the title has to be so compelling to me that it draws me into the story, into what I think of as the second sentence, which is the first sentence of the story. And it's all drawn out of the title. So I would never let anyone rename.
See, your
Once
publisher
when I
doesn't-
submitted a story early in my career,
Yes.
to I think it was the New Yorker. They accepted it, and they told me they were going to change the title, and I was like, "You're going to abduct my child and torture it?" And no, it's not. No, the title is absolutely crucial, and remember that next time someone makes a title for you, don't allow it.
So the publishers aren't slapping sexier titles on your books?
No.
Okay.
They would sell better if they did. But, yeah.
I was encouraged to hear you pursued a PhD but never finished. Why didn't you finish?
Say that again.
Why didn't you finish your PhD?
Oh, that was simple. I had it all worked out. I could have done it, and I was basically looking at a 2-year writing task that was not fiction, and I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
I have to write fiction. I couldn't do it. I was ready to do it. I was prepared to do it. I had a thesis advisor. I took billions of notes. I can tell you lots about the 16th century sonnet, but you looked pained. But 2 years of my life, in my late 20s or early 30s, writing something that isn't fiction, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it, that's all.
I've heard it was difficult to convince you to start teaching.
Yeah.
Were you reluctant to go into teaching?
Very.
But it's a common profession for writers.
It's a common profession now. It's unusual. Just some instinct, especially as a young man. I wanted to know who I was, which to me meant defining myself as a writer. Before would have been easier for me, I think, to define myself as a teacher. I didn't want a certain kind of success. I didn't want any kind of success that wasn't directly related to writing, which is how I tested my success. I don't mean worldly success. I mean just the sense of getting through my day successfully. And I put it off, and by the time I was 40, I had settled down, and okay, I know who I am, and I can teach now.
You're at
Also,
Skidmore
my
now?
father was a teacher, the real thing, who revered teaching, a real scholar teacher. He had a calling. And when you have a calling, if your father is a priest or a teacher, you don't do it lightly. You either do that and nothing else, or you find the other thing. So teaching is a kind of threat to me. It's such a noble thing it's what I would do if I weren't a writer.
You're at Skidmore, right?
I'm at Skidmore.
What encourages you about American literature when you see these students, young writers, I suppose, many of them?
Yeah.
What encourages you? Does anything encourage you?
Many things encourage me. Many things amaze me, because I know exactly what I was writing when I was 17 and 18 and 19 and 20. And of course, there are students who are, not particularly good, but there are really astonishing numbers of students who are really good in a way I can easily compare to my. So how do you? I'm in awe. They're skillful, so it's moving. Yeah.
That's nice. That's good to hear.
They're good.
You have a common complaint about students who want to write? What should they be doing that they commonly don't do enough of?
That's an interesting question. I actually have a very wide variety of students on the introductory level and the advanced level, and they do all sorts of things. The minor complaint I might have is for the kind of writer in an introductory course who has only read zombie and vampire stories and wants to write, and I will not forbid that. I'll say, do that, but come on, there's more to literature and even life than a vampire. But that's relatively rare.
That's good.
They're wide open to instruction.
We're very lucky to have you here today. You have not exactly embraced the kinds of social media that many authors are forced to. You're not a big tweeter, for instance.
I'm not even a little tweeter.
I can't read about you on Facebook every day. What do you think about these social media efforts that so many authors are being asked to do?
To me, it's largely a matter of temperament. My temperament is stay back. Although here I am holding forth on stage. How do you explain that? I like contradictions too. But I don't look at a writer whom I admire and is on Facebook and tweets and disdain him at all. I think that's fine. That's the new way. It's not my way. It's fine. I don't have time to go through life disdaining people writing through the internet.
Just wanted to get that out.
Yeah. But when people look at their iPhones while they're interviewing me, then I get enraged.
What living fiction writers do you admire?
I admire a
And
number of
don't leave
writers.
anyone out.
Apologies. One writer I really love as a short story writer, I bumped into last night. I
Yes.
thought, you actually look like T.C. Boyle, and you're really here. So I love his stories. I love the stories of Tobias Wolff. I'm a fan of Charles Baxter. I'm mostly a fan of short story writers. Novels intimidate me. I'm a slow, patient reader, and they take me 6 months to read a novel. So I'm more likely to reread a classic than to read a new novel. But those are three writers who spring to mind. And there's a group of young, they're not so young anymore. For some reason, they're all women. People like Amy Bender and Judy Budnitz, who do swervy,
Yes.
edgy fiction of a kind that is very interesting to me. So
Yes.
I follow them too.
T.C. Boyle will be here later this afternoon.
T.C. Boyle said that he was going to come toward the end of my lecture and throw a dead cat on the stage. And I invited him to do that. I don't know why. I bring things like that in people.
Do the comparisons to Borges and Nabokov start to pinch and feel uncomfortable?
Yeah.
It's flattering
It's an
at first.
attempt. It's an attempt to be flattering in a way or to fit you
Yes.
in. But if in truth you're a writer and all you do is remind people of famous writers, then you're nothing. Then you're a follower. So there's that feeling too. But what I really think is that in this country there is the realist writer, and then there's the other kinds. The fabulous, the magic realist, the fantasist, the sci-fi, whatever they are. And they're associated immediately with Borges, Nabokov, and Edgar Allan Poe. There's no one else. And sometimes Cortázar gets thrown in. It's a mindless grouping, and I protest for that reason too.
Right. Would you mind taking some questions from the audience?
No, not at all.
There are two microphones. One's right up here, one's here. If you could use those so we can all
If there
hear
are
you.
questions, I can. None?
There we go. Yes, sir.
Who did you read as a young boy and as a young man that gave you the idea that you could become a writer?
As a young boy, you mean really a young boy, like a 6 and 7 year old boy. I remember them really well. One of the biggest influences on my life is to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street by Dr. Seuss, because there you have a horse-drawn milk wagon, and then it's kind of boring. On the next page, there are some new details added to it, and then the next page, even more details, and by the time you reach the end of the book, this simple horse-drawn milk wagon has become an immense fantasy and then returns to the original. And sometimes, if I think of the structure of Martin Dressler in a weird way, I'm writing my own version, sort of. Not Borges, but to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. So those kinds of books, the voyages of Dr. Dolittle, going to strange places and seeing amazing animals, like the Push Me, Pull You, which has one head this way and one head this way, and they try to go in opposite directions but can't move. So that's boyhood, which is full of fantastic things. And as a late teenager, some getting really serious in late high school and early college. Not American literature, I came to that later, but classics of Russian and European literature. Chekhov, Dostoevsky, Thomas Mann, Joyce. These things, when I was 18, blew me away, and I wanted to do something like that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
Why is the museum in that story I told you I love so well called the Barnum Museum?
I can tell you exactly why it's called the Barnum Museum. Because as a child, I grew up in Stratford, Connecticut, right next to the city of Bridgeport. And in the city of Bridgeport is the Barnum Museum, a real Barnum Museum established by P.T. Barnum, who was the mayor of East Bridgeport and even had an immense house in Bridgeport that burnt down in the late 19th century. If you were a child in Stratford in the early 1950s, you were taken on a class trip to the Barnum Museum, to the Tom Thumb House. Everything had to do with P.T. Barnum. And even then, it was presented as a dubious place. That's a real corpse, but whether that blood-stained rag actually was on the body of Abraham Lincoln when he was shot that night, teachers, we're not really sure. There are lots of these all over. So a fantastic place with dubious moral qualities, with cheating involved in it. It's a real museum. If you drive down I-95 from North to South Connecticut, there'll be a big throughway sign pointing to the Barnum Museum. It's still there with a little cupola. That's it.
Yes, sir.
What a wonderfully entertaining discussion. You have me hooked.
I usually don't, so thank you.
Is there any order of reading your books that you think is effective, or just go grab one?
That's interesting. I would start, if you're not sure, with a book of stories, either the new and collected stories, because that's from all over,
And read the titles.
and just read the titles, and then ask for your money back.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, because today is Hobbit Day, which is the day where the characters from The Lord of the Rings were born, Frodo Baggins and Bilbo Baggins, and I was wondering what he thought of J.R.R. Tolkien's whole legendarium, since you're interested in fantasy in a way.
I am interested in a way, but that book came out when I was older, and it's not really, no, I read one of them to my kids, that sort of thing, but I was formed somehow imaginatively before Tolkien came along, and I can appreciate him, but he's not at the center of my imaginative life.
And can I assume that the story you read to them was The Hobbit, I guess?
The first one, yeah,
Okay,
exactly,
All right,
exactly.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I just had a question about writing process. I was wondering, given that you're such an accomplished author, what it's like to take feedback from people, whether they're loved ones or peers or other writers or editors, and how you work through that, because sometimes it can be very hard for a writer to do.
It's hard to do, but I've always done it. Editors are more complicated because they're, as a rule, extremely good, but they also represent the world of sales and so on. So there's always a question whether what they're suggesting really has to do with the good versus evil in a sentence. but I always show any story I write to at least 2 and sometimes 4 or 5 people. And it's difficult, but but the important thing is you can always find someone who doesn't like your work, but that's not the kind of person to show your work to. The kind of person to show your work to is somebody who loves your work, as Robert Lowell once said, but doesn't like all of it and is willing to say why. That's a person you can trust.
Nice.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
What's your daily process when you're working? Like your average day of getting up in the morning till night? I mean, do you write in the middle of the night or?
I did when I was much younger, but now when I'm writing, and and there's plenty of time when I'm in between writing, especially if you're a story writer. I don't just write a story and then go to the store and then write another story. I'd be dead. But when I'm working, I work for roughly 3 hours in the morning, take a break, and 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon, 7 days a week. I have to. And I take it home, and I try not to look at it, but I sometimes look at it, and it's obsessive, it's intense.
Yes, sir.
When you read the work of other fiction authors, do you stick exclusively with realism-type authors, or do you venture out into the fantastical?
I read all sorts of things. I'm particularly attracted to realist authors because I think of myself as having a very particular relation to realism. Realism is what I could do, but there's something in my temperament that says, no, I don't want to do it that way, I want to do it this. And I continually define what that is by reading a really good realist. I don't read realist writers, Tobias Wolff, and despise them. I think, oh, why don't I write that way? What is it? And I find that, but I read all sorts of things. I read lots of nonfiction, history. I'm very erratic as a reader. Yes.
I was wondering if there are any artists or musicians that have particularly influenced or inspired you as a writer.
That's a very good question. I grew up in the kind of household where my mother played the piano all the time. This is strictly classical music. I had piano lessons since I was 7 years old. And sometimes when I'm writing, I actually explicitly think, I want to do in this impressionistic piece what Debussy did in this particular piece. I make connections like that. They're always boringly to classical music, but that's in my blood from early childhood. Painting, less so. I'm moved by all sorts of painters, but I don't think of myself, I don't look at details of the world through words the way painters do through paint. So
when you're writing short stories, do you write a few at a time, or do you pretty much dedicate yourself to finishing one story at a time? And also, some stories can take months or years, and other stories might be written in an afternoon or in a couple of days?
a story can be written in an afternoon. If I could do that, I could write 365 stories.
Well, a couple of days or a week,
700
or it goes to some stories that might take months.
When I write stories, it's one at a time. It's the only thing I have ever written in my life. It's the last thing I will ever write. It's all there is, that story. And then I collapse after it. And the story can take, I usually, nowadays, I can write down the first draft relatively quickly in 3 days, 5 days, 10 days. But a story to me is all about revision, and it will take a minimum of several months, not a year. If I heard of a writer who wrote a 15-page story, literally worked on it 5 hours a day for an entire year, I would actually think something is wrong. There are stories that I work on, and I know that they dissatisfy me, and I can't figure out, those I put in the drawer, and I might come back to them in 1 or 2 years. And in that sense, it takes several years, but No, it's a horrifying thought. A story, 16 pages long, 6 hours a day for 1 year. You're terrifying me. Yeah. Anyway.
Thank you very much for talking
Thank
to
you.
us.
Okay.
Mr. Millhauser will be signing at 2 o'clock.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.